In a quiet London flat at dawn, a woman rested after songs and laughter, unaware that history would soon wrap her final hours in rumor. Some claimed a stray meal betrayed her. Others whispered heartbreak. Yet her truth lingers, suspended between devotion, myth, and memory, waiting to be understood forever. Welcome, dear friends of Midnight Biographies. Share the hour and place from which you listen, and join our gentle circle of storytellers. Subscribe to wander through history's softer echoes tonight. She was born Ellen Naomi Cohen in Baltimore in the autumn of 1941, in a neighborhood where narrow streets carried the scent of coal smoke in winter and honeysuckle in summer, and where families of recent immigrants kept their doors open just enough to share warmth without revealing how little they truly had. Her parents, weary from the long shadow of the Depression and the uncertainties of starting over in a new country, worked hard to give their children a sense of belonging in a world that never seemed to slow down long enough for them to catch their breath. Inside their modest home, laughter mingled with worry, and Cass, even as a child, sensed the heaviness that hovered beneath conversations about rent, illness, and the hope that tomorrow might be easier than today. Yet she possessed a brightness that seemed mismatched with the cramped rooms of her early life. There was something in her eyes that suggested she was listening to melodies no one else could hear, melodies that softened every burden she carried before she could name them. Her childhood, though loving, was shaped by the quiet cruelty of comparison. In those early years, when children rarely question the opinions of others, she learned that her size, even more than her talent, would draw the longest stares. Classmates sometimes whispered behind cupped hands, adults spoke too freely within earshot, and the world around her behaved as though a girl should apologize for the space she occupied. She felt those judgments long before she understood why they clung so persistently to her. Yet within her, there lived a force stronger than shame, a force that lifted her chin each time she felt the weight of others' expectations. It was a restless, searching spirit, one that pushed her to imagine futures brighter than the narrow path laid before her. As she grew older, school became a place of contradiction, a sphere where she felt both out of place and curiously alive. Some days she sat quietly at her desk, trying to shrink herself into her chair, wondering why her body refused to cooperate with the image the world seemed to demand of her. But other days, she discovered that when she spoke, people listened, and when she laughed, they often laughed with her. There was a magnetism about her, a natural generosity that drew in those who felt unseen or misunderstood. She intuitively understood loneliness, perhaps because she had already tasted enough of it to recognize its presence in others, and she held a gentle tenderness for anyone who seemed adrift. It was during her high school years that the first great turning appeared, subtle at first, then unmistakable. One afternoon, she wandered into the school auditorium, where an amateur theater rehearsal was underway. The air smelled of dust and old curtains, and the stage looked more like a forgotten platform than a doorway to possibility. Yet when she watched those students rehearse, she sensed something shifting. She felt the unmistakable pull of a world where one could step into another identity, if only briefly, and be judged solely by the emotion carried in one's voice or the precision of a gesture. Here was a place where bodies of all shapes and sizes moved without scrutiny, where imagination mattered more than perfection, and where a girl who had grown accustomed to averting her gaze could finally look forward without fear. The first time she auditioned, her hands trembled so visibly that she tucked them into the folds of her skirt to hide the shaking. She expected laughter. Instead, she found attention. Her voice, even then, carried a richness that surprised people who thought they already knew her. On stage, she felt both larger and lighter than she ever had before. as though every unkind word ever spoken about her dissolved beneath the heat of the spotlight. The applause she received was not thunderous, but it was sincere, and sincerity was enough to spark something bold within her. From that moment, she returned to the auditorium again and again, drawn by the promise that art might give her a new way to measure her worth. Her love for performing grew into a quiet resolve, a determination that startled even her closest friends. She experimented with names and personas, trying to envision the woman she might one day become. When she settled on the stage name Cass Elliot, it was less an act of reinvention than an act of protection, as though the name could shield the tender parts of her that the world had bruised too often. She borrowed it partly from the admired actress Peggy Cass, partly from a friend whose memory she carried close. In choosing it, she honored both the person she longed to be and the person she had lost. During these years, the circumstances at home did not grow easier, but Cass began to separate her dreams from the daily struggles around her. She studied performances in films, imitated accents in her bedroom mirror, and listened to records late into the night, letting the voices of other artists teach her how to shape her own. Her parents, though practical and often worried, could not help but admire the fire that seemed to grow brighter within their daughter. They wanted stability for her, perhaps a traditional path, yet they knew she possessed something unteachable. They watched as she stretched her imagination far beyond the horizon of Baltimore's row houses, seeking a world that could understand her better than her neighbors did. Still, the tenderness of her early victories could not mask the reality that every step she took toward the performance also drew her deeper into conflict with the limitations placed upon her. For someone who had already felt the sting of judgment so often, the prospect of entering a profession built upon scrutiny seemed both exhilarating and terrifying. She knew that the same stage lights that made her feel powerful could also illuminate every flaw. Yet even this fear became fuel, urging her forward, convincing her that she would rather endure discomfort in pursuit of something meaningful than surrender to a life that asked her to shrink from her own voice. The defining moment came one evening during a school performance. She stood behind the curtain, listening to the murmuring audience settle into their seats. She felt the familiar wave of doubt wash through her, the fear that she might stumble, or be mocked, or be reminded once again that she did not fit the image of a girl on a stage. But when the curtain rose and the warm glow of the lights spread across her face, all hesitation fell away. In that instant, she understood with a clarity she had never felt before that performing was not merely something she enjoyed. It was the truest expression of who she was. And though she could not yet imagine the scale of the journey before her, she sensed it beginning in that quiet moment. When the applause ended and the lights dimmed, she lingered on stage for a moment, reluctant to step back into the shadows. The wooden boards beneath her feet seemed to hum faintly, as if carrying the memory of every performer who had stood there before her. She closed her eyes and listened to that faint resonance, imagining it stretching into her future, guiding her toward a destiny far beyond anything she had yet dared to dream. And as she finally stepped away, the lights flickered once, as though offering her a silent farewell. The faint flicker of those stage lights seemed to follow her as she walked away from the modest high school auditorium and into the wider world, stretching and brightening until they resembled the tall, shimmering marquees of New York City. In her imagination, the bulbs hummed softly above bustling sidewalks, each one carrying the promise of transformation. And though she had not yet traveled farther than a few neighboring states, the glow of those imagined marquees guided her like distant constellations. By the time she finished school, the idea of remaining in Baltimore felt too small, like a costume she had outgrown. She wanted a stage large enough to hold her voice, a place where reinvention was not only accepted, but expected, and where the narrow expectations of her childhood could be left behind like an old script no longer worth performing. So she packed what little she owned and left for New York, following the path carved by dreamers long before her and hoping it would hold steady beneath her feet. Her first days in the city were filled with the nervous exhilaration that belongs only to the young. The buildings towered overhead like guardians of ambition, and the streets swelled with people who seemed to be rushing towards some unseen horizon. Cass moved among them with a mixture of awe and determination, studying their faces, listening to the sharp rhythm of their voices, and wondering where her own might someday fit. She auditioned wherever she could, often waiting hours in long hallways, clutching sheet music or monologues, telling herself that every rejection would teach her something she needed to know. She rented a tiny room with creaking pipes and a window that rattled in the winter wind. And each night she lay awake imagining what it would feel like to see her name on a poster or hear her voice echo through a great theater. Her hope was not naive. It was simply larger than the discouragement that pressed against her from all sides. But reality, as she soon discovered, had its own pace, indifferent to the urgency of her longing. Casting directors looked at her kindly, but skeptically, as though trying to reconcile the depth of her voice with the body that carried it. They praised her personality, complimented her unusual confidence, and told her to return later, after they had finished considering others. She auditioned for a role that would later become famous, believing she had found the part that would introduce her to the world. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine the producers seeing in her what she had always felt, but rarely heard echoed back. But when the decision was announced, the role went instead to a rising young performer named Barbra Streisand, whose voice and presence were undeniable even in those early days. Cass congratulated her respectfully, yet inside she felt the quiet collapse of a dream she had nurtured with such care. It was her first true heartbreak as an artist, and it arrived not through cruelty, but through the steady, impartial reality of competition. Still, the disappointment left a mark that would not fade quickly. She walked home that evening through the bright, indifferent streets, listening to the sounds of the city without truly hearing them. She wondered if she had misread her destiny, if the world of acting might never open its doors for her, no matter how fiercely she knocked. Yet beneath her sorrow, something else stirred, a restless curiosity that suggested her path might not lie where she had first believed. If the stage would not have her, perhaps another form of expression would. The shift came slowly, then all at once. One evening, she wandered into a small club in Greenwich Village, drawn by the murmur of conversation and the warm, low notes of a guitar drifting through the doorway. Inside, she found a gathering of folk musicians, their voices weaving together in harmonies that felt both ancient and immediate. The air carried the scent of coffee and old wood, and the audience leaned forward as if leaning into a shared secret. Cass stood at the back, feeling a strange familiarity rise within her, as though she had stumbled upon a place where emotion mattered more than appearance, and where the authenticity of a voice could cut through any barrier. She returned the next night, and the night after that, gradually befriending musicians who saw in her something she had long struggled to name. They invited her to sing, and though she hesitated at first, the encouragement in their eyes gave her courage. When she finally opened her mouth, the room shifted. Her voice, so full and resonant, filled the small space with a warmth that surprised even her. The musicians exchanged glances of recognition, the kind that appear when one realizes they have encountered someone who does not yet understand the strength she carries within her. In that dimly lit room, beneath strings of mismatched lights, Cass felt the shape of her identity begin to change. The The more she immersed herself in music, the more she sensed that this path might offer her freedoms the theater could not. Here was a world that embraced imperfection, that welcomed outsiders, that valued the raw and unpolished truth of a performer's soul. She joined small groups, singing wherever she could, learning to blend her voice with others and discovering the intimate power of shared harmony. At home, she practiced late into the night, letting her voice rise and fall like waves against a shore. She listened to old records and tried to understand how emotion could be carried not only in lyrics but in breath, rhythm, and tone. The more she learned, the more she realized she had never truly been auditioning for the stage. She had been waiting for the discovery of this deeper, truer home. Her parents, though puzzled at first by her sudden shift from acting to singing, soon recognized the certainty in her voice when she spoke of her new work. They worried for her, as parents often do, but they also understood that the world had drawn her into its current and that resisting it would only dampen the fire that made her who she was. Cass visited home when she could, carrying stories of late-night rehearsals, smoky clubs, and the strange, beautiful characters who populated the city's musical landscape. She felt older each time she returned, not in the sense of weariness, but in the sense of having lived something meaningful. And yet, amid her growing confidence, she remained aware that she was venturing further away from the expectations that had once defined her. Music offered freedom, yes, but also uncertainty, instability, and the constant pressure to prove oneself anew. Each performance carried with it the careful balance of vulnerability and strength, the knowledge that a single off night could unravel weeks of hard work. Still, she felt more alive in these challenges than she ever had in the scripted world of theater. One night, after a particularly moving performance, she lingered alone in the empty club as the last patrons drifted out and the owner dimmed the lights. The golden glow stretched across the floorboards in long, thin lines, reminding her once more of the stage lights from her youth. But this time, they did not flicker with uncertainty. They held steady, as if illuminating a path she had finally learned to trust. She stood in that quiet, listening to the soft hum of the amplifiers as they cooled, and she wondered, just for a moment, whether this new world might lead her toward greatness or toward heartbreak. She could not know yet, but the question settled around her like a soft shadow as the lights dimmed and the city moved on without noticing her departure into the night. The soft hum of those cooling amplifiers seemed to stretch into the following days, becoming the rhythmic footsteps she heard on countless small stages and rehearsal room floors as she moved steadily deeper into the folk scene. Each wooden board beneath her shoes carried the faint vibration of possibility, though she could not yet know how much of her life would be shaped by the harmonies she was learning to build with others. In those narrow clubs, filled with cigarette haze and low conversation, she found her footing among musicians who valued authenticity over polish. They recognized that her voice carried both tenderness and power, and they welcomed her into their circles with a warmth she had rarely felt among the rigid expectations of the theater world. Yet, even as she flourished musically, there remained a quiet ache within her, a longing for connection that would soon lead her toward one of the most influential and complicated relationships of her life. It was during this period that she joined a group called the Big Three, where she learned the discipline of collaboration and the delicate balance of supporting and being supported by fellow artists. The trio rehearsed in cramped apartments, improvised harmonies late into the night, and played to audiences who sometimes numbered barely more than the musicians on stage. Cass, however, approached each performance with the same sincerity, as though she understood instinctively that even the smallest room deserved her full heart. Her laughter often filled the spaces between rehearsals, a bright sound that lifted the spirits of those around her, though she seldom spoke aloud of the loneliness that sometimes followed her home after the applause faded. The big three eventually gave way to another group, the Mugwumps, as friendships and musical partnerships shifted in the restless tide of the early 1960s folk revival. It was with the Mugwumps that Cass encountered a man who would alter the emotional landscape of her life, Denny Doherty. He possessed an easy charm, a gentle wit, and a voice that carried both mischief and melancholy in equal measure. The first time they harmonized together, Cass felt a sensation that was both thrilling and unsettling, as though a long locked door within her had opened just a little. She admired his talent, respected his instincts, and almost immediately sensed that her heart was in danger of wandering toward him. Denny, for his part, saw in Cass a rare musical gift, a voice that could lift and carry melodies with astonishing grace, though he did not yet understand the depth of her feelings. Their growing friendship became the quiet center of her days, a source of joy even as it stirred uncertainties she held close. Cass found herself watching him during rehearsals, following the easy arc of his smile, interpreting the smallest gestures as signs of something she dared hope might become real. Yet her heart, brave as it was, also housed a lingering fear. The fear of being overlooked, of being seen in every way except the one that mattered most. She had learned, painfully and early, that affection could be complicated by appearances, and she sensed that Denny, kind though he was, might also struggle to see beyond the surface the world so often judged her by. While her affection for Denny deepened, another unexpected thread wove itself into her life. One of her bandmates, guitarist James Hendricks, found himself facing the uncertain future of the military draft during a turbulent era. In an act of both practicality and compassion, Cass agreed to marry him so he could avoid being conscripted. The marriage was not born of mutual passion or shared dreams, but rather of necessity, a formal arrangement stitched together with the fragile threads of circumstance. The ceremony was quiet, almost rushed, without the sentiment one might expect of such a moment. Those who witnessed it understood its purpose, and Cass herself held no illusions. She cared for Hendricks as a friend and colleague, but her heart remained tethered to Denny in ways she still hoped might one day be acknowledged. The months that followed were both productive and uncertain. The Mugwumps continued to perform, though their popularity remained modest. Cass, increasingly aware of the band's limitations, wondered if a larger destiny awaited her somewhere beyond the confines of these small clubs. She wanted to build something enduring, something that would allow her voice to reach audiences far beyond the dimly lit rooms she knew so well. She hoped, too, that if she stepped boldly into the next stage of her career, Denny might follow, or at least recognize the strength of her devotion. Instead, fate took a different turn. The Mugwumps dissolved after 8 months, their momentum lost to shifting ambitions. Each member faced a crossroads, and Cass found herself momentarily adrift, uncertain where the next path might lead. She waited, though she would never fully admit it, for Denny to choose a direction that included her. But Denny joined a new group forming on the West Coast, a trio led by John Phillips and his wife, Michelle. They called themselves the New Journeymen, a name that suggested progress and reinvention, though for Cass, it signaled a painful distance. She felt the sting of abandonment, not through malice, but through the simple truth that Denny had chosen a road she had not been invited to travel. Still, Cass's spirit was not one to surrender easily. She resolved to find her own way forward, to carve out a place for herself in a world that often demanded more from her than from others. She continued performing, searching for new collaborations, experimenting with musical styles, and sending word to friends in Los Angeles that she remained eager for opportunities. And though she tried to focus on her craft, the knowledge that Denny was beginning a new chapter without her clung to her like an unwelcome shadow. Her marriage to Hendricks, which had been little more than a legal arrangement, quietly unraveled during this period. There was no dramatic rupture, only the recognition that the union had fulfilled its purpose and could not sustain itself beyond that. She signed the papers without ceremony, knowing that the end of this marriage did not extinguish the deeper longing she carried for someone who did not yet love her in return. When the final document was placed before her, she held the pen for a moment longer than necessary, as though hoping the ink might carry away some of the sorrow she never spoke aloud. In the days that followed, the faint rustle of the unsigned divorce papers lingered in her memory, a small but persistent reminder of endings and beginnings intertwined. When she finally stood from the table and stepped toward the door, the papers shifted slightly in the draft, their edges lifting as though stirred by an unseen breath. That soft movement remained with her, accompanying her thoughts as she walked out into the night, uncertain of her next destination, but propelled by the steady determination that had guided her since childhood. And as she stepped into the street, the lifted corner of the page seemed to beckon her onward, toward a future she could neither predict nor resist. The lifted corner of the paper, trembling softly in the draft, lingered in her thoughts long after she stepped outside. That slight movement, so small that another person might never have noticed it, remained with her like a quiet reminder that life often shifts direction on a breath, not a declaration. As she walked into the evening air, that trembling edge seemed to transform into the loose edge of a sail catching wind, carrying her imagination far from the quiet Baltimore streets of her youth and toward the distant brightness of the Virgin Islands, where a curious chapter of her story would later take shape. It was there, beneath a sky of impossible blue and sunlit scaffolding, that a strange tale would be born, one that followed her for decades, woven from equal parts misunderstanding, myth, and the human desire to soften an uncomfortable truth. But before the islands entered her life, another journey awaited her, one shaped by determination, rejection, and a longing so entwined with her musical ambitions that it became impossible to separate one from the other. After the mugwumps dissolved, Cass drifted for a time between small performance opportunities, unsure of her next step, but certain that she could not remain still. She was restless, propelled by an instinct she trusted even when circumstances offered no clear guidance. Her voice had grown stronger, more confident, and she sensed that somewhere beyond the dim stages she knew, there was a group waiting for her, even if they had not yet realized it. When she learned that Denny had joined the New Journeymen, a trio led by John and Michelle Phillips, she felt a jolt of conflicting emotions. Pride for his new opportunity, sorrow for the distance it created, and a deep conviction that she belonged in whatever future he was building. She did not say this aloud, even to herself at first, but the feeling settled quietly inside her, steady and persistent. So she followed the group, not out of desperation, but out of a belief that her voice could complete something they had only begun. John Phillips, a man of sharp instincts and sharper standards, had a vision for the sound he wanted, a careful blend of harmonies shaped by calculation as much as emotion. Michelle's airy sweetness paired easily with Denny's warm tenor, but something remained missing: an anchor, a grounding resonance, a voice that could give weight to their delicate structure. Cass knew she could provide this. Denny knew it too. But convincing John Phillips proved far more difficult. Publicly, John insisted that Cass's voice simply did not blend with the trio. He described it as too low, too forceful, too unlike the register he imagined for the group. But privately, he confessed to others, including, in time, Michelle, that his resistance came from something far more personal and far more painful for Cass to hear. He believed she was too heavy, that her appearance did not match the image he wanted for the group, that audiences might not accept her, no matter how extraordinary her voice might be. These judgments, rooted in prejudice rather than artistry, cut deeper than any critique of her singing ever could. Cass had long grown accustomed to sizing herself against the expectations of others, but to have her dreams halted by such superficial reasoning reopened wounds she had worked for years to heal. Still, she refused to disappear quietly. She followed the group from rehearsal to rehearsal, not intruding, but lingering nearby, hoping that John might eventually hear the sound she was certain could elevate the trio into something remarkable. She carried equipment when asked, fetched drinks when instructed, endured jokes meant to amuse, but that instead revealed how little respect she had been granted. Some nights she returned to her hotel room exhausted not by the physical demands of the day, but by the emotional strain of feeling so close to belonging, yet kept at arm's length. And yet she stayed. Not because she lacked self-worth, but because she sensed, with a clarity that bordered on destiny, that the three voices she heard blending in rehearsal would not reach their full potential until her own joined them. According to Michelle, the trio treated Cass during these days with a kind of careless indifference, as though she were not a fellow musician, but an overeager admirer who could be tolerated so long as she did not expect too much. They teased her gently sometimes, unkindly at others, allowing her to rehearse harmonies only to inform her later that she would not be performing on stage. These moments stung, and Cass carried their weight silently, unwilling to bow beneath them, but not yet sure how to rise above them. Still, even amidst the discouragement, she held on to one truth. She belonged with them. Her voice told her so every time she rehearsed alone at night, shaping harmonies she knew their arrangements lacked. Then, as so often happens in stories of ambition and reluctant acceptance, circumstance intervened. The new journeymen, for all their musical promise, were not immune to the financial strain that haunted many young groups in those years. They lived freely, spent generously, and often placed pleasure before practicality. In time, their funds dwindled, and they found themselves adrift in Los Angeles without the means to secure a place to live. In their moment of need, they turned to the one person they knew would not turn them away. They arrived at Cass's door, weary and uncertain, and she welcomed them with the same open-hearted generosity she had always offered. It was here, in this modest Los Angeles home, that the shape of their future changed. Faced with the reality of sleeping on the street, John Phillips hesitated before finally agreeing to a condition that could no longer be avoided. Cass would join the group, not because he suddenly recognized the brilliance of her voice, but because necessity forced him to reconsider what pride had previously denied. Some would later claim that her addition to the group was inevitable, the natural consequence of artistic evolution. Others insisted that the decision emerged from desperation rather than inspiration. Whatever the truth, the group that stepped out of Cass's home in the days that followed was no longer the new journeymen. They were something new, something larger, something shaped at last by the fullness of sound she brought with her. Yet even as this practical explanation began circulating, another, more unusual story took root, one that transported Cass not to an apartment in Los Angeles, but to the Virgin Islands. According to this alternate version, she had been walking beneath a construction site during a trip to St. Thomas when a metal pipe fell and struck her on the head. The impact, the story claimed, altered her voice, allowing her to reach the high notes John required. It was an improbable tale, and Cass herself reportedly encouraged it at times, choosing the gentleness of myth over the humiliation of the truth. For decades, fans repeated it, not to demean her, but to marvel at the strange alchemy of chance. Only later would those close to the group reveal that the real reason behind the delay in her acceptance had nothing to do with her range and everything to do with the very prejudice she had battled her entire life. Still, whether born from necessity or fate, the moment Cass joined the group marked the beginning of a transformation. They rehearsed late into the night, blending their voices into the shimmering harmonies that would soon become their hallmark. And as they prepared to step into the world together, they chose a new name, one that captured the warmth and intimacy of their sound, the Mamas and the Papas. Yet even as they celebrated this new beginning, Cass stood slightly apart for a moment, listening to the harmonies she had fought so hard to join. She knew the journey ahead would be difficult, perhaps even painful, but she also knew that her voice, at last, was part of something greater than she had ever imagined. She stepped forward, ready for what came next, but as she did, a faint, muffled harmony drifted through the room, one she had never sung, one that seemed to echo from behind a thin door she had finally been permitted to open. The muffled harmony behind that thin door lingered in her ears as she stepped into the rehearsal space, no longer an outsider listening from the hallway, but a member at last, standing among the voices she had chased across cities, clubs, and unkind judgments. The sound grew fuller as she approached, as though the harmonies themselves were aware of a missing note finally returning to its place. In that moment, Cass felt both a trembling anticipation and a quiet relief, as though some long-held breath inside her had finally been released. She took her place beside the others, lifting her chin slightly, waiting for the first chord to begin. It was a simple gesture, but for her, it carried the weight of every door that had once been closed to her. And when the music started, her voice rose instinctively, meeting theirs with a warmth and strength that made all four turn their heads in subtle recognition. The blend was immediate, organic, as natural as tides moving toward shore. It was here, finally, unmistakably, that she belonged. The days that followed were filled with the feverish excitement of creation. The newly formed quartet rehearsed tirelessly, exploring combinations of sound that seemed to reveal themselves like stones uncovered by retreating waves. John Phillips, despite his earlier resistance, could no longer deny the richness Cass brought to their arrangements. Her voice grounded the group, giving depth to Michelle's bright sweetness and framing Denny's warmth with a resonance that made their harmonies shimmer. Even John's own baritone settled more comfortably into the mix now that Cass's presence filled out the lower registers with ease. The sound they created together felt almost cinematic, each voice distinct yet inseparable from the others, as though they had been waiting, not 1 year or two, but lifetimes to meet in this exact configuration. Still, this early period was not without its tensions. The very dynamic that made the group extraordinary also contained the seeds of future heartache. Cass, for all her professionalism, could not silence the ache she felt each time Denny laughed with Michelle or leaned too close to whisper something only she could hear. They were beautiful together, in a way that seemed sanctioned by the world, and Cass found herself caught between admiration and longing, between wanting only their musical unity and secretly wishing their personal bonds had been shaped differently. She buried these emotions beneath her devotion to the group, channeling her unspoken love into the purity of her singing. Yet even in the music, traces of her yearning lingered, audible only to those sensitive enough to hear the undertones of a heart carrying both gratitude and sorrow. As the group refined their sound, they began searching for a name that matched the spirit of their identity. One night, after a long rehearsal, conversation drifted toward the growing West Coast music scene, toward the new cultural movements that were reshaping ideas of family, community, and creativity. Someone mentioned the affectionate terms used among emerging hippie circles, mamas and papas, words that suggested comfort, informality, connection. In that moment, something clicked. The name seemed to arrive without anyone truly choosing it, as though it had been waiting for them. They became the mamas and the papas, a title that felt inviting and organic, perfectly suited to the warmth and intimacy their harmonies conveyed. With the name settled, opportunities began to unfold rapidly. Their first recording sessions revealed a magic that surprised even the seasoned producers who witnessed it. When Cass stepped into the studio microphone's glow, something inside her steadied. The lights overhead hummed softly, and the world outside seemed to fade into darkness. She delivered her vocals with a clarity that startled those who had underestimated her. The engineers exchanged quiet nods from behind the glass, adjusting dials with growing enthusiasm. In playback, the harmonies layered over one another like soft fabric, dense and luminous. The group felt it too. This was not merely music, but something approaching revelation. During these sessions, Cass experienced a moment she would later recall with particular tenderness. After recording a complex section that demanded both precision and emotional restraint, she stepped back from the microphone, unsure whether she had given enough. But when she glanced toward the control booth, she saw an expression on Denny's face that she had wanted to see for years. A look not of affection or desire, but of admiration, unmistakable and sincere. He mouthed the words, "That was beautiful." And though they were small, they settled into her like a balm. For a moment, her heart lifted, lighter and freer than it had been since the earliest days of their friendship. As the group's confidence grew, so did their closeness. They rehearsed on beaches at sunset, in small apartments after midnight, in open fields where the wind tugged playfully at their hair. Sometimes during these informal sessions, Cass would close her eyes and imagine that all the struggles that had preceded this moment had been necessary steps towards something luminous. And for a time, she allowed herself to believe that this harmony, this fragile balance of voices and personalities, might last indefinitely. Yet beneath the beauty of their collaboration, there lingered an unease that Cass could not quite name. At first, it appeared only in fleeting moments, like a shadow passing over the surface of a calm lake. A joke at her expense that lasted a beat too long. A suggestion that she smile more for promotional photographs. A remark from John about the importance of image, spoken with the careless tone of someone who does not realize or does not care how deeply such words can wound. Cass absorbed these small injuries with the quiet resilience that had carried her through adolescence, but they left traces nonetheless, like faint bruises that never fully faded. One evening, after an especially long rehearsal, they reviewed potential lyrics for a new song. The room was filled with the gentle warmth of shared accomplishment, yet when Cass read the line, meant as a playful nod to the group's early struggles, "No one's getting fat except Mama Cass," she felt a familiar sting rise in her chest. She laughed with the others, brushing off the discomfort as best she could, but the words lingered in the air long after the laughter faded. She knew the nickname was meant affectionately, perhaps even admiringly, but it carried with it the weight of every prejudice she had ever encountered. Still, she did not protest. She chose instead to focus on the music, on the possibility that their sound might eclipse any small pains she endured along the way. When they left the studio that night, Cass walked a few steps behind the others, listening as the lyric echoed faintly in her mind. The streetlights swayed gently above her, casting soft halos on the pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a solitary voice hummed the line again, drifting toward her as though carried on an unseen breeze. And though she tried to dismiss it, the words followed her into the darkness, whispering a question she did not yet know how to answer. The faint echo of that lyric, drifting like a half-remembered lullaby through the dark street, followed her into the next morning. It clung to her as she awoke, still lingering somewhere between dream and memory, a reminder that even within triumph there could be shadows. As she rose and prepared for another day of rehearsals, she tried to brush the feeling away, telling herself that all groups developed internal jokes, that teasing was part of camaraderie, that she should not read too deeply into words meant to amuse. Yet the echo persisted, soft but insistent, threading itself through her thoughts as she walked into the sunlit studio where the mamas and the papas gathered once again. She smiled, as she always did, and offered her warmth freely. Still, something inside her remained unsettled, as if that whispered line had tapped a place she had kept carefully hidden from those around her. In the studio, the group launched into another day of shaping harmonies and refining arrangements. The music filled the air with a shimmering brightness, and Cass allowed herself to be swept into its current. Singing had always been her refuge, the place where everything else quieted and the world narrowed to a single, steady note. Yet today, even the music felt slightly altered. She sensed a new distance growing between her and the others, a subtle shift in tone that she could not quite explain. When John made a casual remark about publicity photos needing to reflect the group's overall image, Cass felt her cheeks flush, though he had said nothing explicitly about her. She nodded without protest, as she often did, but the unease in her chest tightened. The unease lingered as the days passed, though she did not speak of it to anyone. Instead, she poured her energy into the music, strengthening the structure of each song with her voice and intuition. She impressed producers with her control, supported Michelle's delicate vocals with gentle steadiness, and helped Denny find emotional threads within certain lyrics that he had not yet discovered. Her contributions were essential, undeniable, yet she often felt invisible once rehearsals ended. The others drifted away in pairs or trios, wrapped in conversations or private intimacies from which she remained apart. Cass walked home alone more often than not, humming bits of unfinished melodies into the night, wondering whether she should have asked for more from those who depended so heavily on her talent. It was during this period of quiet uncertainty that the truth Cass had long sensed but desperately wished to avoid finally revealed itself. One afternoon, while the group rested between rehearsals, she noticed Michelle and Denny slipping out of the studio together. Their movements were subtle, careful, but Cass, who loved Denny with a devotion she rarely dared admit, felt something inside her turn cold. She tried to reason with herself, telling her heart not to leap to conclusions, not to assume pain where none had yet been spoken. But when they returned, their shared glances carried an intimacy that could not be mistaken. Cass saw it instantly, and though she had prepared herself for many possible disappointments in this life, nothing had prepared her for this one. Later that evening, as they walked toward their cars, Denny approached her with a gentleness that struck her as both kind and unbearably cruel. He began to speak, haltingly, explaining that he and Michelle had grown close, that something between them had unfolded almost without their understanding. Cass listened quietly, her heartbeat loud in her ears, her vision blurring at the edges. She had imagined many conversations with Denny over the years, confessions of love, apologies, perhaps even promises, but never this. When he finished, she managed a small smile, though it trembled like a candle in wind. She wished him happiness, because what else could she do? Even in the depths of heartbreak, her instinct was to protect the people she loved from pain, even if that protection cost her dearly. But the hardest moment came later, when Michelle approached her privately. Cass saw the hesitation in her eyes, the discomfort of a woman who knew she had stepped into a place where another heart had long waited. Michelle apologized softly, explaining that she had never meant to hurt her. Cass listened, tears forming but not falling. After a long pause, she finally asked the question that had lodged itself in her throat since the moment she understood the truth. "You can have any man in the world," she whispered. "Why did you take the one man I love?" The question hung in the air like a fragile note, delicate and aching. Michelle had no answer, and Cass did not expect one. Some hurts were too old, too deep, too entangled in longing to be soothed by explanation. For a time, Cass withdrew into herself. She still attended rehearsals, still sang with the same precision and beauty that had shaped their sound from the beginning, but a quiet heaviness settled around her. She carried it in her shoulders, in the way she lowered her eyes when she entered a room, in the long silences that filled the spaces once occupied by her laughter. The others noticed, though they did not always know how to respond. Music, however, remained her anchor. In the studio, she delivered some of her most moving performances, infusing each line with emotions she could not voice in conversation. Producers commented on the deepened richness of her tone, unaware that sorrow had become part of her instrument. Yet even in grief, Cass found moments of tenderness. There were evenings when Denny lingered after rehearsals, speaking with her gently, offering friendship she wished she could accept without pain. There were mornings when Michelle attempted small gestures of kindness, hoping to lessen the strain between them. And there were nights when Cass sat alone in her apartment, listening to recordings of their harmonies, trying to understand how something so beautiful could coexist with a hurt so profound. She loved the group deeply, loved the sound they created together, the possibilities unfolding before them, but she could not deny that the foundation beneath her had shifted. One evening, after a long day of rehearsals, she remained in the studio after the others had gone. The lights had been turned low, casting soft shadows that stretched across the floor like quiet companions. Cass stood before the microphone, touching its metal edge with a gentleness that surprised her. She closed her eyes and sang a single note, holding it longer than necessary, feeling its vibration travel through her chest and into the stillness of the room. When the note faded, she opened her eyes, catching the faint reflection of herself in the studio glass. A woman both strengthened and wounded by the depths of her devotion. She took a deep breath and stepped back, letting her hand fall from the microphone. The amplifier behind her emitted a low hum as it cooled, a quiet reminder of the music that had shaped her life so completely. That hum lingered, steady and unbroken, as though carrying her unspoken questions into the night. And as she walked out of the studio, the last echoes of that hum trailed behind her, signaling the beginning of a new chapter, one that would challenge her in ways she had never imagined, yet also reveal truths she had long avoided. The low hum of the amplifier trailed her into the hallway, dissolving into the cool air of the night as she stepped outside. Yet even as the sound faded, it left a vibration inside her, a subtle trembling that she carried into the days that followed. That hum, steady and unresolved, became the quiet undercurrent of her life as the group prepared for a trip that would draw them far from the familiar rhythms of California and into a chapter marked by uncertainty, rumor, and shadows she never could have foreseen. The echo of that hum deepened as they boarded a plane to London, a city whose fog-softened streets would soon hold both disappointment and the first fractures in the delicate unity of the mamas and the papas. London greeted her with a chilled breath, its narrow lanes shimmering beneath soft rain, its rooftops rising like watchful silhouettes against a gray sky. Though Cass had always been drawn to new places and unfamiliar atmospheres, something in the London air felt different, dense, restless, almost withholding. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself as she moved through the city, trying to shake the quiet heaviness that had settled over her since the revelation of Denny and Michelle's affair. Music remained her mooring, yet even rehearsals were colored now by an awkwardness none of them could quite mask. Still, Cass carried herself with the grace she had always offered the world, stepping lightly across cobblestones, greeting strangers warmly, and reminding herself that she had weathered deeper wounds than this. The song that had followed her home in California, the whispered line about Mama Cass, echoed faintly again as she unpacked her suitcase in the modest London apartment she had rented. The room smelled of old floorboards and dust warmed by radiator heat. She placed her clothing carefully in the narrow wardrobe, humming softly to distract herself from the discomfort around her. The city outside pulsed with distant music and passing buses, and she told herself that she would adapt, that she would find her footing even here, in a place where the past seemed unable to loosen its grip. In the days that followed, she explored London's lively music clubs, meeting singers and musicians whose accents carried the pulse of another culture. She visited small cafes where warmth rose in clouds from steaming cups, listening to local artists sing melodies that were at once foreign and familiar. Yet despite these brief moments of solace, tension continued to coil beneath her daily life. She knew the rest of the group would join her soon, preparing for a performance that had been eagerly anticipated. For now, she filled the time with walks along the Thames, letting the river's muted flow quiet her thoughts, though only for a little while. Then came the incident that would follow her for years, wrapped in rumor and misunderstanding, another weight upon her already burdened shoulders. One evening, Cass returned to her apartment after browsing a local market, settling in to rest her voice before upcoming rehearsals. The apartment's owner had left detailed instructions on how carefully the furnishings were to be used, though nothing struck her as unusual. But late that night, the soft knock at her door startled her. When she opened it, two uniformed London officers stood outside, their expressions polite yet unmistakably stern. They explained that the building's caretaker had accused her of taking bed linens from the apartment, an oddly specific and bewildering charge. Cass blinked in confusion, unable to comprehend how such a trivial matter had escalated to police involvement. She tried to explain that no such thing had happened, that the linens remained exactly where she had found them, but the officers insisted she accompany them for questioning. The chill of the night seeped through her coat as they escorted her into the street, and she felt a familiar sting, the shame of being judged before being understood. It was not the first time life had placed her in this position, but it never grew easier. The hours that followed were disorienting. She sat in a cold, stark room at the station, answering questions she knew made little sense, the fluorescent lights above her humming in a tone that reminded her painfully of the studio amplifier she had left behind. What she did not know at the time, but would learn only through whispered fragments later, was that her arrest had little to do with linens and everything to do with a man whose name had drifted at the edges of her social circles. Pick Dawson, a charismatic figure rumored to be both a lover and a supplier. Authorities, it seemed, had been looking for leverage, and Cass, warm-hearted, trusting Cass, had been caught in the orbit of someone whose life intersected with danger she never meant to invite. Whether or not she had ever truly been involved with Dawson, the police believed she might yield information. But when the questioning turned up nothing of value, and when no evidence supported the claims against her, she was released without charges. Still, the damage had been done. Word of her detainment spread quickly, bruising her reputation just as the group arrived in London. The promising performance they had hoped to give was abruptly canceled, the promoters wary of the controversy. Cass stood before Denny and Michelle, trying to explain, her voice cracking with exhaustion and humiliation. She felt the old ache return, the ache of being misunderstood, of bearing consequences not entirely of her making, of feeling the ground shift yet again beneath her feet. Even as the scandal lost momentum in the papers, the emotional toll lingered. Cass walked the London streets in a fog of disbelief, the city around her blurred by the weight of what might have been. The Thames no longer brought her comfort. Its dark waters seemed to carry her fears downstream, leaving her with the cold sensation that the foundations beneath her life were weakening. She wondered late at night whether this incident would follow her forever, stitched into the tapestry of her identity by those who saw only the surface and not the person beneath. One night, she left the apartment to clear her mind, stepping into the damp London air. The fog settled around her shoulders like a veil, obscuring the shapes of passing cars and distant lampposts. She walked without a destination, drawn by the low hum of the streets, hoping that movement alone might soothe her restless heart. But as she crossed a quiet square, a sudden gust of wind lifted the fog around her, twisting it into delicate patterns before letting it settle once more. She paused, watching the swirling mist as it stretched into the darkness, vanishing like a question unanswered. Behind her, the last echo of her arrest still clung to her thoughts, whispering the beginnings of fears she could not yet name. But ahead, the fog opened onto a dimly lit path. Its edges softened as though guiding her toward another chapter she was not prepared to refuse. She inhaled deeply, feeling the cold air sharpen her senses, and began walking again, unsure of where the road would lead, but knowing she had no choice except to follow. The fog that opened onto that dimly lit path seemed to move with her for several steps, shrinking and expanding like a quiet breath against the night. It drifted around her ankles, softly swirling as though coaxing her forward, until she reached the corner where the street lamps cast pale cones of light on the glistening pavement. Cass paused there, letting the cold settle over her skin. The familiar heaviness of worry still pressed on her, shaped by the London incident and the unspoken tensions within the group, yet something in the shifting mist whispered of turning points. It suggested that even the darkest confusion would one day give way to a clearer horizon. Still, she could not yet imagine that horizon. She carried too much weariness in her chest, too many questions about her future, and too many unsteady feelings surrounding the three people whose voices had become so entangled with hers. When she returned to the apartment that night, she sat at the small kitchen table, tracing the grain of the worn wood with her fingertips. She wondered how music, so generous and luminous, could sit beside moments of deep humiliation, as though the two were destined to coexist in her life. She tried to steady her thoughts, reminding herself that she had survived far harsher judgments than this. And yet, there was no denying that the London incident had bruised her spirit. It had overshadowed the joys she had hoped to find here, and it cast a faint veil over the dynamic growing among the mamas and the papas. Still, Cass remained certain of one truth. Her place in the group was not an accident. Her voice had transformed their sound. Their harmonies needed her. That truth steadied her enough to rise from the table and turn off the lights, letting the hum of the old refrigerator follow her into uneasy sleep. When morning arrived, its gray light softened by thick clouds, Cass gathered her belongings and made her way to the small cafe where she was set to meet the others. As she walked through the narrow streets, she could feel the damp air pressing against her coat. Yet beneath that heaviness, her determination rekindled. London had wounded her pride, but she would not let it bury the hope she carried. She approached the cafe with a quiet resolve, prepared to face whatever awaited inside. When she entered, she found Denny, Michelle, and John seated at a table near the window. Their expressions, though awkward, were not cold. They offered her small smiles, soft, hesitant, but sincere enough to suggest that the incident would not sever their bond. Rehearsals resumed in a quiet studio, not far from the river. At first, Cass felt a stiffness in the air, like an unresolved chord. Yet as they began to sing, the tension gradually softened. Something in the music drew them back into alignment. Their voices still found one another with ease, weaving together in the gentle, luminous blend that listeners would one day associate with the sound of an era. Cass felt her heartbreak, her humiliation, and her longing threaded subtly through her singing, giving their harmonies a depth that had not existed before. The music seemed to speak for her, offering a language she trusted more than words. When they returned to the United States, the energy around the group shifted once again. A new opportunity emerged, a song that would carry Cass into national recognition as a solo vocalist, even while she remained part of the quartet. Dream a Little Dream of Me became her quiet triumph, a soft and wistful melody that seemed perfectly shaped for the emotional hues of her voice. She recorded it with a mixture of restraint and vulnerability, allowing the notes to rise and fall like a breath drawn from lived experience. When the song was released, it touched listeners immediately. They heard something aching, yet tender, in her delivery, something that invited them into her inner landscape without revealing too much. The success of the song signaled a subtle shift in her identity. It allowed Cass, for the first time, to imagine herself not just as part of a group, but as an individual artist with her own voice, her own story, her own destiny. She began to feel that her career might someday move beyond the confines of the mamas and the papas, not out of bitterness or separation, but as a natural evolution. The idea both frightened and inspired her. She had found security within the group's harmonies, yet she knew the time would eventually come when she would need to carry her own melody alone. As the group's internal tensions continued to grow, rehearsals occasionally took on a strained quality. Denny and Michelle's relationship, though quieted, still flickered beneath the surface. John's exacting standards sometimes collided with Cass's emotional sensitivity, creating moments of sharpness that cut deeper than he intended. And Cass, though outwardly composed, carried the weight of all these dynamics inside her like stones tucked into a pocket. She performed with unwavering professionalism, but she often returned home feeling hollowed by the effort. It was during one of these difficult weeks that the conversation about a potential solo career began to surface more frequently. Producers and friends quietly suggested that Cass had the presence and vocal color to carry her own recordings. They told her that her warmth, charisma, and unique timbre were elements that audiences gravitated toward instinctively. Cass listened with modest curiosity, uncertain whether she could truly step away from the structure that had given her both heartbreak and stability. Yet, each time she recorded a track that highlighted her voice alone, she felt that familiar steadiness rise in her, echoes of the girl who had first stepped onto a high school stage, feeling the light on her face and understanding that music would be the central thread of her life. One evening, after a long rehearsal, Cass lingered alone again in the studio. The others had drifted out into the night, leaving behind only the warm scent of coffee and the soft vibration of recently played chords. She approached the microphone, its silver mesh reflecting the dim light. She closed her eyes and sang the opening lines of "Dream a Little Dream of Me," letting her voice wrap around the words as though she were singing them to her younger self. The sound, gentle and full, floated into the quiet space. When she finished, She stood still for a moment, listening to the last echoes fade into the corners of the room. She did not yet know that this song would become a defining moment in her life, that it would carry her into a future she could not yet picture. She only knew that, for this moment, the music felt like a bridge between where she had been and where she might go. And as she stepped away from the microphone, she lifted her eyes toward the darkened hallway beyond, seeing in its shadows the faint outline of a path she had not yet dared to follow. At the end of the hall, the dim glow of the exit sign flickered softly, as though urging her forward. It pulsed once, twice, then held steady, waiting for her to decide whether she would step through it. The faint pulse of the exit sign held her attention for several long seconds, glowing in the quiet hallway like a wavering promise. Its steady illumination seemed to breathe in the dimness, neither bright nor weak, simply present, waiting for her, watching her, inviting her to consider the possibility of a life lived beyond the familiar walls of shared harmonies. Cass stood motionless, her fingertips resting lightly on the edge of the microphone stand. She felt suspended between her past and her future, between the comfort of belonging and the uncertain freedom of stepping forward alone. When she finally exhaled, the sound was soft and nearly lost in the stillness, yet it carried the weight of a woman at a threshold. Her eyes lingered on the sign a moment longer, and then she turned away, not out of reluctance, but because her journey would not begin with a dramatic gesture. It would begin, instead, with a quiet decision, shaped slowly over time until it revealed itself fully. For now, the sign remained behind her, glowing steadily as she walked back into the night. In the months that followed, Cass felt the early stirrings of transformation quietly weaving through her days. The success of Dream a Little Dream of Me created a subtle shift in how producers and audiences viewed her. Though the group remained together in public appearances, the focus often drifted toward her warmth, her humor, and the unmistakable richness of her voice. She felt both flattered and uneasy, grateful for recognition, yet wary of the new expectations forming around her. At the same time, internal disagreements among the group sharpened. Old tensions resurfaced, new ones took root, and Cass found herself caught between loyalty to the ensemble and the growing awareness that their paths might soon diverge. During this period, she also began confronting a deeper struggle, one that had accompanied her since childhood, but now took on sharper edges under the weight of fame. Producers, promoters, and even acquaintances made careless remarks about her appearance, sometimes couched in humor, sometimes disguised as concern. Photographers positioned her behind chairs, behind other group members, or at particular angles designed to soften her silhouette. Cass bore these indignities with quiet resilience, but each one pressed into her heart, leaving imprints that accumulated over time. And when whispers arose about a possible solo contract, the pressure intensified. Some advised her to lose weight before embarking on a new chapter, suggesting that the public might not be ready for a star who did not fit the narrow beauty standards of the moment. The idea lodged itself inside her, sharp and unforgiving. Cass had always longed for acceptance, yet she also understood the harsh truths of the entertainment world. She knew how quickly opportunities could vanish, how easily a singer could be overshadowed by image-based expectations. And so, propelled by fear as much as hope, she made a decision that would alter her life in ways she could not foresee. She embarked on a regimen that she believed might help her step confidently into her next chapter. A diet so extreme, it would reshape not only her body, but her health, her stability, and the future she imagined for herself. At first, the fasting seemed manageable. Cass pushed through the initial days with determination, reassuring herself each time hunger gnawed at her that she was doing what was necessary to secure her career. But as the weeks stretched into months, 7 long months in total, the intensity of her routine grew. She limited herself to eating only 3 days a week, sometimes far less, convincing herself that each sacrifice brought her closer to the success she sought. The scale shifted, her clothes loosened, and those around her noticed the change. Compliments mixed with comments about her appearance, and though Cass smiled graciously, she carried a growing unease inside her. The cadence of her days began to blur. She felt herself weakening, physically and emotionally, yet she pressed onward, believing she had no choice but to continue. Her friends expressed worry, though gently. They knew Cass valued independence and rarely asked for help. But they saw the fatigue in her eyes, the subtle tremble in her hands, the way she sometimes swayed slightly when rising from a chair. The pressures of fame were rarely spoken aloud among them, yet they hovered continually in the background, shaping choices and carving paths no one quite understood. Cass reassured them that she felt fine, that she was simply preparing for her upcoming residency at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, a major contract that could cement her place as a solo artist. She spoke of the opportunity with genuine excitement, yet beneath her words lay a fragile hope that the sacrifices she had made would finally yield something worthy. As her opening night approached, the physical consequences of her extreme dieting became impossible to ignore. Cass developed acute tonsillitis, which caused painful swelling in her throat. Soon after came hemorrhaging in her vocal cords, a frightening development for any singer and devastating for someone preparing for the most important performance of her career. She also contracted mononucleosis, which drained her energy, and then a severe case of hepatitis, an illness that weakened her further and required rest she could not afford. Cass spent her rehearsal days fighting exhaustion and forcing her voice to rise above the strain her body endured. She told herself that she had come too far to step back now. When she arrived in Las Vegas, the atmosphere crackled with anticipation. The glittering lights of the Strip shimmered against the desert night, and the marquee bearing her name cast a warm glow along the walkway. Friends and colleagues gathered from across the entertainment world: Sammy Davis Jr., Jimi Hendrix, Mia Farrow, each eager to witness her debut as a solo star. Cass stood backstage in her flowing gown, listening to the hum of the crowd, trying to steady the flutter of nerves in her stomach. She told herself that she could push through her ailments for one night, that the music would carry her even if her voice faltered. But when she stepped on stage, the truth asserted itself. Her body, weakened by months of deprivation and illness, could not support her voice. Most of her strength had been drained long before she reached the microphone. She sang with the tenderness and sincerity that defined her artistry, but her voice emerged thin, strained, often swallowed by the vastness of the hall. The audience, filled with admiration, listened with confusion, unsure how to reconcile the star they adored with the fragility they now heard. Cass tried to hold steady, yet she felt her breath weakening, her notes slipping away like threads pulled from a tapestry. Her contract required 2 shows a night. After the first performance, she retreated backstage, trembling with exhaustion. She knew she should rest, but she also knew the second show awaited her. She returned to the stage because she could not bear the thought of disappointing those who believed in her. But the second performance unfolded much like the first. Her voice flickered, dimmed, and struggled to rise. The audience, murmuring with disappointment, began to drift out. By morning, newspapers had delivered their verdict with a cruelty sharper than she could have imagined. One publication compared her debut to the sinking of the Titanic, an image that pierced her deeply, settling into the tender places where she had always felt most vulnerable. When dawn broke over the desert, Cass sat alone in her hotel room, hearing those words echo through her mind. She felt her dreams shift beneath her, their edges frayed by both circumstance and the punishments she had inflicted upon herself. Outside, the neon lights dimmed as the city moved on, indifferent to the private sorrow unfolding within its walls. But Cass, though shaken, still carried the ember of a spirit that had sustained her through many trials. She rose slowly, gazing at the window where early sunlight pressed against the glass. Something in that soft glow whispered that her story was not yet defined by this failure, that even the deepest disappointments could lead to unforeseen paths. Behind her, the silence of the room deepened, heavy with unanswered questions. But somewhere within that stillness, the faint flicker of possibility remained, waiting for her to notice it once more. The faint flicker of possibility glowed only weakly in that quiet Las Vegas hotel room, but it did not vanish. It lingered like a small flame in the corner of her vision, refusing to let the darkness claim everything. Cass sat still for a long while after the sun had risen, letting its pale warmth seep through the window and settle on her shoulders. The silence around her felt heavy, yet not entirely hollow. Beneath her disappointment and exhaustion, she sensed a truth she had felt many times before. Life would not destroy her. It might bruise her, derail her, confuse her, but it would not extinguish her voice. She breathed slowly, gathering the fragments of her strength, and as she did, a new thought drifted gently into her mind. It was not about fame or music or the expectations of strangers. It was something quieter, closer to the heart, something that had begun growing within her long before Las Vegas had tested her limits: her daughter. The thought arrived like a soft beam of light through the dimness, reminding her of a love far more profound than public opinion or harsh criticism. Months before her ill-fated performances, Cass had given birth to a child, a small, bright-eyed girl named Owen. The world did not know her well, for Cass had guarded her fiercely from prying questions and speculative headlines. And now, in the aftermath of her humiliation, it was Owen who filled Cass's thoughts with a sense of grounding she desperately needed. She remembered the way her daughter's breath rose and fell lightly against her chest, the warmth of her tiny fingers curling around her own. These were things untouched by critics or audiences, moments that belonged only to the two of them. Cass rose slowly, walked to the window, and pressed her palm against the warm glass. The city below glittered with the remnants of a night that did not know or care about her heartbreak. Yet somewhere far from the neon lights, in a quieter home untouched by stage lights and contracts, her child existed as a reminder that her life was larger than applause. With that realization came a feeling she had not expected, an easing of pressure, a softening of the relentless demands she had placed on herself. Perhaps, she thought, success could take many shapes. Perhaps it could be found not only in a perfect performance, but also in the quiet devotion of motherhood. When she returned home days later, she stepped into the familiar stillness of her living space and felt it wrap around her like a gentle embrace. Owen was there, bright, curious, and unaware of the storms her mother had weathered. Cass held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, and felt her own heart begin to steady. She sang to her softly, not as a performer, but as a mother, her voice unburdened for the first time in weeks. And in that moment, the idea of fame seemed less urgent, less central to her identity. What mattered most was here, in her arms, safe and warm. Still, motherhood brought its own challenges. Cass wished desperately to protect Owen from the relentless curiosity of the press, from the speculation that swirled around the identity of her father. Reporters had already begun whispering, asking questions, inventing stories. Cass refused to answer. She did not wish to share the intimate details of her private life with the world, especially not details that might later cast shadows over her child. So she shielded the truth, insisting that her daughter's origins were a matter for her alone. Yet the secrecy stirred curiosity, and curiosity bred rumors, some benign, others cruel. She hired nannies to help her balance the demands of performing and parenting, but she dismissed them quickly if they grew too close to the child or asked questions Cass was unwilling to answer. She knew people gossiped about her protectiveness, but she did not care. Owen was the one place in her life where she set the boundaries rather than having them imposed upon her. And she would not risk that stability, not for the approval of the public, nor the comfort of acquaintances who believed they understood her better than she understood herself. As she rebuilt her confidence in the months after Las Vegas, Cass began performing again on television programs and in smaller venues. The glare of the spotlight no longer filled her with the same urgency. She approached her work with a quieter purpose, embracing opportunities without expecting them to rewrite her life. Audiences still loved her, perhaps more than before, for her warmth, her authenticity, the unfiltered truth of her presence. She smiled on stage, sang with sincerity, and slipped back home into the sanctuary of motherhood. But fame has a way of inviting shadows, even when a person longs for nothing more than a moment of peace. Cass hosted lively gatherings at her home, inviting artists, musicians, and writers to share evenings filled with laughter and song. These parties became part of Hollywood lore, warm, unpredictable, infused with the generosity of a woman who loved to bring people together. It was during one of these gatherings, according to persistent rumor, that she crossed paths with a man whose name would later haunt the fringes of her story, Charles Manson. The details were never clear, nor were they ever proven. Some said he appeared only once, brought by acquaintances during the era when he drifted through Los Angeles, knocking on doors with his guitar and seeking attention from musicians. Others insisted he stayed longer, speaking with Cass in the corner of a dimly lit room. Cass never confirmed these stories. She dismissed them when asked, though not with enough force to silence speculation. In truth, very few knew what had transpired that night, if anything at all. Yet, years later, after the horror of the crimes committed by Manson and his followers, the association, real or imagined, cast a faint shadow across Cass's public image. What wounded her most was not the rumor itself, but the accusation that came from within her own circle. John Phillips, whose sharp tongue could injure with surprising precision, suggested that Cass bore some responsibility for having allowed Manson into their world. It was an unfair allegation, born of fear more than fact, but it pierced her deeply. She could not understand how a man who relied so heavily on her voice could place such blame at her feet. She withdrew from him emotionally, offering only polite professionalism where warmth had once existed. Yet even in this wound, she remained dignified, choosing silence over retaliation. Life continued in this complicated rhythm: public smiles, private uncertainties, and the constant balancing act between artistry and motherhood. Cass felt the passage of time more acutely now, aware that her choices carried consequences not just for her, but for the small child who relied upon her. The music industry remained unsteady beneath her feet, shifting with new trends and the ever-changing tides of public taste. Still, her voice endured. It softened where needed, soared when allowed, and carried with it the weight of a woman who had lived deeply, loved fiercely, and paid dearly for both. One evening, after a long taping for a television special, Cass returned home to find Owen asleep on the couch, curled around one of her scarves. She lifted the child gently, holding her close, and felt the familiar swell of tenderness rise within her. It overcame every disappointment, every rumor, every careless word spoken by someone who had never truly known her. As she sat in the quiet living room, rocking her daughter gently, she listened to the slow rhythm of the child's breath. In that soft, steady sound, she found something that music alone could never give her, a sense of purpose untouched by the world's judgments. Outside, the night deepened, settling gently against the windows. Cass closed her eyes, letting the warmth of her daughter's small body rest against her heart. She did not know what storms lay ahead, but in this moment she felt anchored, not to the stage, not to the critics, but to the quiet truth of the life she was building, piece by fragile piece. In the stillness, the soft breath of her sleeping child became the new sound that carried her forward, replacing the hum of amplifiers and the echoes of stages. It was a rhythm she would follow into the next uncertain chapter of her life, where old shadows would return and new trials would rise, shaping a destiny she could not yet foresee. The soft breath of her sleeping child continued to echo in her thoughts long after she laid Owen gently into her bed. That quiet rhythm followed Cass through the hallway, drifting beside her like a fragile melody composed not for the stage, but for the tender spaces of a mother's heart. It lingered through the night, steady and warm, and when morning came, it remained with her still, guiding her steps as she prepared for the challenges ahead. Yet as comforting as that sound was, its gentleness soon met the harsher murmurs of the world outside, murmurs fed by rumors and restless imaginations. The more Cass retreated into the safety of motherhood, the more insistent those murmurs became, weaving shadows where none should have existed and binding her once again to whispers she had never invited. The parties she hosted, filled with laughter, music, and the familiar comforts of companionship, began to take on a life of their own in the public imagination. People spoke of them with curiosity, embellishing details, adding color to moments that had merely been part of the natural ebb and flow of creative circles. Some of those gatherings included rising stars, established musicians, actors, writers, and wanderers of the cultural landscape. Cass welcomed them all with her characteristic warmth, offering food, music, and the kind of easy acceptance that made people feel seen. But as the city changed, as the late 1960s gave way to a darker, more fractured time, her hospitality became a canvas onto which others projected their fears. It was during this period that the rumors surrounding Charles Manson began to tighten uncomfortably around her name. Cass, generous with invitations and slow to judge, had crossed paths with countless musicians drifting through Los Angeles. Among them, according to scattered accounts, may have been a young man still unknown to the public, a man who claimed to write songs and sought recognition from producers. Whether he truly entered her home or merely occupied the periphery of her social world was a detail lost in time. But after his crimes unfurled across the nation, cruel and unfathomable, the idea that Cass might have unknowingly welcomed such darkness into her home became a convenient story for those who sought meaning in chaos. The rumors alone would have been painful enough, yet the deepest wound came from someone she had once trusted. John Phillips, whose ambitions and careful image-making had often overshadowed his empathy, suggested in private conversations that Cass bore some blame for having allowed Manson's presence near their circle. It was an accusation born more of fear and displacement than fact. Still, when fragments of his judgment reached her ears, Cass felt the cut with an intensity that surprised even herself. She had given so much to the group, carried so many of its burdens, and now found herself marked by a narrative that had little to do with truth. She did not confront John. Confrontation had never been her way. Instead, She stepped further back from him, letting her heart protect itself in silence. Though her career continued, and though she appeared on television with her usual grace, Cass felt the shadows lengthening around her. She sensed that her life was once again becoming crowded with interpretations she could not control. Yet in the quiet corners of her home, with Owen sleeping safely nearby, she found a sanctuary untouched by rumor. Here she read stories aloud, sang lullabies, and rediscovered the warmth of small routines. It grounded her, even as the world outside remained unpredictable. In these quieter months, Cass also found herself reaching instinctively for companionship. Not the brief, polite connections that often accompanied fame, but something deeper, something rooted in the longing she had carried for so many years. It was in this vulnerable space that she met Donald von Wiedenmann, a man whose background seemed as complex as the shifting currents of her own life. He was a journalist, reserved yet attentive, and heir to a Bavarian barony that lent a curious blend of mystique and old-world formality to his presence. He carried himself with a gentleness she found comforting, and for a time, Cass allowed herself to imagine a future that included both stability and affection. Their relationship unfolded quickly, woven from shared dinners, whispered confidences, and the fleeting comfort of being understood. Donald admired Cass's wit, her passion for music, and her devotion to her daughter. Cass, in turn, admired the steadiness he appeared to offer. In a life filled with turbulence, he seemed to anchor her in ways she had not anticipated. And so, when he proposed marriage, she accepted, not impulsively, but with a hopefulness that had long been absent from her heart. Yet, hopes born from vulnerability can sometimes dissolve as quickly as they form. The challenges of blending their worlds, their expectations, and their private wounds soon surfaced. Cass, ever generous, opened her heart fully. Donald, however, carried uncertainties he struggled to articulate. Their union, though sincere in the beginning, soon strained beneath the weight of unspoken fears and incompatible desires. And so, after only 2 months, they parted. A quiet dissolution without public spectacle, marked by sadness rather than conflict. Cass returned home, holding in her hands the papers she had signed to end the marriage. She sat at her kitchen table, the same place where she had once traced the lines of the wood after her arrest in London, and let the quiet settle around her. The pen she had used to sign the documents lay beside her, still and silent. After a moment, it rolled gently off the table's edge and onto the floor, its small sound echoing in the stillness of the room. Cass bent to pick it up, feeling its weight in her palm. A simple object, yet filled now with the echo of another ending in a life already full of them. The next morning, she awoke with a renewed resolve. She gathered her strength, reminding herself that heartbreak did not define her path. She had survived harsher disappointments, deeper sorrows. And though the loneliness pressed dimly at the edges of her thoughts, she knew she still had her voice, her child, and a resilience that had carried her through every chapter of her life. She rose from her bed, walked into the living room where Owen played quietly with a set of wooden blocks, and smiled as the child's laughter filled the space. Outside, the world awaited her once more, full of opportunities, uncertainties, and the familiar hum of expectations. She inhaled deeply and stepped forward, ready to face whatever would come next. Yet as she reached for the doorknob, the faint echo of the pen rolling across the table drifted back into her memory, lingering like a question that had not yet been answered. It was this small, unsettled sound, soft, almost forgettable, that accompanied her into the next chapter of her life, one marked by warning signs she could not yet recognize, a collapse she would soon brush aside, and a journey toward a final stage where music, exhaustion, and fate would converge once more. The faint echo of the pen rolling across the table followed her into the days ahead, a soft reminder of endings that arrived quietly, without spectacle. Cass moved forward nonetheless, carrying the small sound with her like a pebble in her pocket, unseen but never entirely absent. It lingered in her thoughts as she resumed her career, appearing as a subtle tremor beneath her growing exhaustion. For though she tried to leave the sadness of her brief marriage behind, her body and spirit had begun to show signs of strain that could no longer be explained away by heartache alone. The world demanded her energy, her presence, her smile, yet she possessed less and less to give. Still, she pressed on, believing as she always had that music would steady her, that performance would gather her pieces together long enough to keep moving. In the early months of 1974, Cass found herself juggling multiple commitments, television appearances, rehearsals, meetings, and the delicate rhythms of motherhood. She felt tired in ways she could not name, a weariness that extended beyond sleepless nights or emotional burdens. Sometimes her breath caught unexpectedly, sharp and brief. Sometimes she felt a sudden dizziness when rising from a chair. And sometimes, when she sat quietly in the afternoon light with Owen nearby, she sensed a heaviness in her chest that made her pause. Yet she dismissed these sensations, convincing herself that fatigue was natural for a woman raising a child alone while nurturing a demanding career. She reminded herself of the crash diet months earlier, believing her body might still be recalibrating. She assured friends she was fine, even when concern flickered across their faces. It was during this period that she appeared on The Tonight Show, a familiar stage where she had shared laughter and music in earlier, brighter times. Backstage, the air buzzed with the usual mixture of nerves and excitement. Lights glowed softly overhead, the set shimmered with the sleek polish of late-night television, and Cass greeted the crew with warmth that belied her exhaustion. But as she waited for her cue, preparing to walk toward the curtain that would open onto the audience, she felt a sudden wave of weakness wash over her. The edges of her vision dimmed, and the floor beneath her seemed to shift. Before she could steady herself, her knees buckled and she collapsed. Those nearby rushed toward her, their voices rising in startled concern. Water was offered, a chair quickly pulled close, and the show's medic examined her as gently as time allowed. Cass insisted she was fine. She explained that she had not eaten enough that day, that her blood sugar had simply dropped. She laughed lightly, brushing away the incident as though it were nothing more than a momentary inconvenience. The medic advised rest, but Cass, ever determined, insisted on continuing. She walked onto the stage soon after, smiling as the applause rose, concealing the tremor still lingering in her limbs. The next day, she mentioned the incident casually in an interview, describing it as just a little tip-over. She assured the public she felt perfectly well. Yet, in the privacy of her home, she could not ignore the quiet fear that crept into her thoughts. She understood, if only instinctively, that her collapse had not been caused by hunger alone. But she also believed in perseverance. She had built her life upon it, enduring rejection, heartbreak, prejudice, and disappointment with grace. It felt unimaginable to withdraw now, to step back at a moment when new opportunities were beginning to emerge again. So, she pushed forward into a summer that would demand more of her than she expected. In July, she traveled to London for a 2-week engagement at the Palladium, a venue that held the promise of renewed acclaim. The city greeted her with a gentler light than it had years before. The turmoil of the earlier arrest felt distant, almost unreal. She settled into the rhythm of rehearsals, determined to give her best to an audience that had long admired her. Yet each day left her more fatigued than the last. Her voice, though still warm and recognizable, carried a subtle strain she could feel, but hoped others would not hear. She pushed through with the same courage that had carried her since childhood, disguising her discomfort behind professionalism. The Palladium performances unfolded with moments of brilliance and moments of struggle. Some nights the notes rose effortlessly, carried by the subtle glow of the stage. Other nights her breath faltered, her throat tightened, and she fought quietly to maintain control. Still, audiences applauded her with affection, grateful simply to be in her presence. Cass, ever gracious, smiled brightly, bowed deeply, and left the stage feeling both triumphant and unsteady. After the final show, she was invited to a gathering at Mick Jagger's home, a birthday celebration filled with musicians and friends. Cass attended, eager for a moment of levity after weeks of disciplined focus. Yet throughout the evening, those who knew her well noticed something unsettling. Her laughter remained warm, but her complexion carried a pallor that concerned them. She coughed occasionally, pressing a handkerchief to her lips. When asked if she felt well, she offered her usual reassurance. She was just tired, she said. She had simply pushed herself too hard. The night continued with easy conversation and soft music, but Cass's presence dimmed as the hours passed. When she finally rose to leave, wishing Mick well and thanking him for the evening, a friend noted the slight unsteadiness in her step. Still, she insisted on attending a brunch the next day in her honor, hosted by Georgia Brown. She arrived wearing a smile, but beneath it was a visible fragility, frequent coughing, moments when she paused to catch her breath. Concern flickered again among those gathered, but Cass waved it away gently, explaining that travel had always worn her down. Later that evening, she attended yet another gathering, this time at the apartment of the American entertainment journalist Jack Martin. The room glowed with lamplight, filled with quiet chatter and the easy camaraderie of old acquaintances. Yet Cass, usually the bright center of any room, seemed strangely distant, cheerful but muted, present but weary. People spoke with her warmly, but beneath their smiles lay a shared, unspoken worry. Something was not right. Her eyes were tired, her voice softer than usual, and her breath seemed shallower, as though each one required deliberate effort. When she left the gathering, stepping into the cool London night, she reassured those nearby that she only needed rest. She was staying at an apartment owned by Harry Nilsson in the Mayfair district, a quiet, comfortable place where she hoped to recover before returning home. The lights were low when she entered, the rooms still and familiar. She placed her bag on a nearby chair, exhaled slowly, and prepared for sleep. It was there, in that quiet apartment, that she spent her last known moments awake. Breathing softly, settling into the stillness, unaware that the exhaustion she had brushed aside for weeks was not merely fatigue, but a final warning her body could no longer withstand. Behind her, the closing door whispered into the night, leaving an unsettled silence in its wake. A silence that would deepen into grief by morning when she failed to emerge from her room. The unsettled silence behind that closing door lingered in the quiet hallway long after she entered, settling over the apartment like a thin veil. It hovered there through the night, faint and unmoving, as though the air itself sensed a heaviness it could not name. Cass, weary from weeks of pushing her voice and her body beyond their limits, slipped into the bedroom seeking only rest. A simple wish, the most human of needs, yet the one she had denied herself for far too long. The soft lamplight cast gentle shadows across the room as she laid her belongings aside. She moved slowly, her breath shallow, her steps careful. The day had been full, noisy with conversation and concern she had tried repeatedly to brush away. Now, in this quiet space, she let the exhaustion settle into her limbs. She prepared for bed, dimmed the lights, and finally lay down, letting her eyes close as the room faded into darkness. Outside, London exhaled its familiar sounds: distant traffic, muffled voices, the low rumble of the city shifting into its nighttime rhythm. Inside the Mayfair flat, however, silence deepened. Hours passed, steady and unbroken. The building's old pipes sighed occasionally. The walls creaked faintly with the settling of the night, and the city moved on, unaware of the stillness behind one particular door. Somewhere in the earliest hours, when night is darkest and the world feels suspended between breath and dawn, Cass slipped quietly from consciousness into something deeper. No struggle, no alarm. A quiet surrender to a body too worn to continue the rhythm it had carried faithfully for 32 years. Morning arrived gently, pale light brushing against the curtains, nudging the corners of the room into view. The house remained still. It was only when Cass's secretary arrived, expecting to greet her with plans for travel and rest, that the lingering silence grew heavy with concern. After calling her name once, twice, then a third time, he approached the door to her room. He knocked softly, then more firmly. Still no answer. A feeling of dread crept through him as he opened the door at last. The sight that met him was devastating in its simplicity. Cass lay in the bed as though merely sleeping, her head resting gently on the pillow, the blankets drawn lightly across her. There was no sign of distress, no evidence of struggle, only a profound stillness, the kind that life leaves behind when it quietly steps away. For a long moment, he could not move. The world seemed to tilt, the air turning thick around him. When at last he found his voice, it cracked in the effort to call for help. Authorities arrived swiftly, yet the room's quiet made their presence feel strange, intrusive even. A doctor examined her and concluded what would become the official cause of death: heart failure. A sudden, tragic end, yet one not entirely surprising for a woman who had endured extreme dieting, illness, and relentless professional demands. Those who knew Cass well had seen her exhaustion, felt her strain, and worried silently. But few imagined it would end like this, in a peaceful room, far from home, in the gentle stillness of early morning. As news of her death began to spread, it traveled with both tenderness and cruelty. Friends and fellow musicians wept, recalling her laughter, her generosity, the warmth that radiated from her in every circle she entered. Yet the public, hungry for simple explanations and unaware of the toll years of pressure had taken on her, latched onto a detail that would soon distort into myth. On the bedside table, officers found a sandwich, a harmless object, insignificant in its presence. But rumors grew rapidly, evolving into a cruel falsehood that Cass Elliot had died choking on a ham sandwich. It was a narrative shaped not by truth but by prejudice, by the persistent cultural fixation on her weight, and by the unkind ease with which people reduce a life to a single exaggerated image. Those who loved her were devastated by the rumors spread, devastated too by how readily it overshadowed her legacy. Doctors clarified repeatedly that no food had been obstructing her airway, that her death had nothing to do with eating. But the myth persisted, whispered carelessly, repeated endlessly, becoming one of the most harmful misconceptions attached to her name. Meanwhile, Cass's family grieved privately. Her daughter Owen, only a child, would grow up learning much later how fiercely her mother had protected her identity, how carefully she had shielded her from the world's curiosity. After Cass's death, Owen was cared for by Cass's younger sister Leah, who provided the stable home Cass had always hoped for her daughter. The question of Owen's father, which Cass had guarded closely, remained unanswered for many years. Only decades later, through conversations and shared memories, did Michelle Phillips reveal what Cass had kept secret: that the father was Chuck Day, a gifted guitarist who had played alongside the group in their early years. The revelation added a quiet note of resolution to a story long shrouded in speculation. Back in London, the apartment where Cass had taken her final breaths gained an eerie legacy of its own. 4 years after her death, Keith Moon, drummer of The Who, spent a night in the same flat. He, too, would die at the age of 32 in the very same room. The coincidence deepened the aura of mystery surrounding the place, though no one could explain why fate had chosen such a strange and somber repetition. As tributes began to pour in, the world remembered Cass not only for her tragic end, but for the brilliance she had shared. Friends spoke of her luminous voice, her kindness, her unguarded humor. Fellow musicians recalled the way her harmonies transformed entire arrangements, giving the group its signature sound. Audiences remembered the joy she brought to their lives, joy that rose effortlessly from her, sincere and unmanufactured. In time, her legacy grew clearer, her contributions undeniable. The cruelty of the rumors faded slowly, replaced by a collective understanding of who she truly was. A woman who had given the world music filled with warmth and longing, who had persevered through prejudice with grace, who had loved deeply and generously, and who had carried within her a resilience that still echoes in every recording she left behind. Years later, when her name was honored with a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, friends and family gathered not in mourning, but in gratitude. They spoke of her courage, her talent, her rare ability to make people feel welcome in her presence. They spoke, too, of the fragility she had carried silently, and of the need to remember her for more than the myths that once distorted her story. On that day, beneath the soft California sun, her daughter Owen stood beside the star, a quiet testament to the love that had shaped Cass's truest legacy. Inside the memory of that London flat, quiet, dimly lit, the door closed softly behind her, the silence that filled the space now holds not just sorrow but reflection. It marks the threshold between her final night and the story that would continue long after, carried by those who cherished her voice and understood, at last, the depth of her journey. And in that lingering stillness, there remains a final unanswered whisper, a soft, steady breath that seems to drift into the distance, beckoning toward her legacy still unfolding. The soft, steady breath that drifted into the distance lingered far beyond that London morning, carrying with it the unanswered questions that so often accompany the final chapter of a life lived in the public eye. It followed her loved ones home across the ocean, settling into quiet corners of memory. And even years later, those who knew her best could recall the exact sensation of that breath, gentle, unfinished, as though inviting reflection rather than closure. It was this breath, this sense of an unspoken moment suspended just beyond reach, that carried Cass's story into the hearts of those who mourned her. Yet as grief slowly softened into remembrance, people began to look not only at how she died, but at how she lived, how she fought, how she rose, and how she shaped music in ways that could never be undone. The hush that followed her passing did not silence her. Instead, it formed a quiet threshold through which her legacy continued to walk. In the weeks after her death, friends gathered in living rooms and rehearsal spaces, sharing stories that drifted between laughter and tears. They remembered how Cass would walk into a gathering with a warmth so immediate that even strangers felt like old friends. They spoke of her generosity, of the way she offered comfort without waiting to be asked, of her uncanny ability to make people feel seen in a world that often hurried past them. Musicians reminisced about nights spent harmonizing with her until dawn, marveling at the effortless way her voice seemed to wrap their melodies in something richer, warmer, more complete. It was that voice, unmistakable even in its softest whisper, that had first carried her into fame. Yet for those who loved her, it was the person behind the voice who lingered most vividly. As months passed, tributes emerged in newspapers, on radio programs, and in television specials. Some focused on her artistry, noting the particular timbre of her voice and the vital role she played in defining the sound of the 1960s. Others explored her influence on contemporary musicians, many of whom credited her with inspiring them to pursue harmony-driven music. Yet amid the admiration, there remained an undercurrent of regret. Regret that the world had not protected her better, that it had not offered her the grace she so willingly extended to others. People spoke with increasing clarity about the cruelty she faced, about the endless scrutiny of her body, and about the way such pressures might have contributed to her final exhaustion. In telling her story, they began to understand that her struggles were not hers alone, but were part of a broader cultural moment that measured women by impossible standards. For Owen, who was still too young to grasp the full meaning of loss, Cass's absence created a quiet emptiness that could not yet be named. Her Aunt Leah, who took her in with steadfast devotion, surrounded the child with familiarity and care. She kept Cass's memory present in gentle ways, from photographs placed lovingly around the home to small stories shared at bedtime. As Owen grew older, she learned to piece together the story of her mother not from scandal or rumor, but from the warmth of those who had truly known Cass. She learned that her mother had been brave in the face of constant scrutiny, that she had sung with a heart full of generosity, and that she had loved her daughter fiercely enough to shield her from the world's curiosity. These truths formed the foundation of Owen's understanding, offering her a sense of identity not rooted in mystery, but in love. The question of her father's identity remained untouched for many years, held closely by those who felt it was Cass's story alone to share. Only much later, when time had softened the sharper edges of the past, did Michelle Phillips reveal the truth: that Chuck Day, a talented guitarist who had played alongside the group, was Owen's father. The revelation, once spoken aloud, cast a new light on Cass's life, not as scandal, but as a tender acknowledgement of a private decision she had made with great deliberation. Cass had chosen to raise her daughter independently, believing that the world needed no explanation beyond the love she provided. In doing so, she demonstrated a quiet strength that had often been overshadowed by narratives shaped without her consent. Years continued to pass, and with them came a growing appreciation for the depth of Cass's contributions. When the Mamas and the Papas were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1998, surviving members gathered to honor the music they had created together. The air carried both celebration and sorrow as they stood on stage, performing once more the songs that had defined their youth. Yet in the harmonies, a clear absence could be felt. Cass's parts required not one voice, but several. 3 singers standing together, doing their best to approximate the fullness she had once delivered without effort. The attempt, though sincere, underscored the singularity of her gift. Even in memory, her voice remained irreplaceable. Tributes continued in other forms. Musicians spoke of her in interviews, noting the emotional intelligence she brought to every performance. Writers explored her story with increasing nuance, peeling back layers of myth to reveal a more authentic portrait. And fans, some who had followed her from the beginning, others who discovered her through recordings years after her passing, found solace in her music, hearing in it a sincerity that transcended time. Her songs remained fixtures at gatherings, on radio stations, in films, and in the quiet corners of people's lives where comfort was needed. Yet one of the most meaningful acknowledgments came decades after her death, when Cass was honored with a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. It was a warm October day, and her family, now grown, now standing with the quiet dignity she had once carried, attended the ceremony alongside friends and admirers. Michelle Phillips, who had witnessed Cass's triumphs and heartbreaks firsthand, stood at the podium and spoke with gratitude for the time they had shared. She remembered Cass not through the lens of stardom, but through the bond they had forged, at times strained, at times strengthened, always complex. Owen, now an adult, stood nearby, seeing her mother celebrated not for the myths that had overshadowed her life, but for the truth of her talent and spirit. As the star was unveiled, its polished surface catching the sunlight, a hush fell over the crowd. For a moment, the noise of the city faded, replaced by a stillness that carried the essence of the woman being honored. Cass's name shone there, permanent and unencumbered by rumor, marking not only her place in history, but the reclamation of her story. Those gathered felt it, a sense of gentle closure, not finality, but recognition. In that space of reflection, people understood that Cass Elliott's tragedy did not lie solely in her untimely death. It lay in the burdens she carried quietly, in the pressures she endured without complaint, in the kindness she offered even when the world met her with judgment. And yet her story was not only tragic, it was luminous, courageous, and full of the music she gave freely to others. As the ceremony ended and the crowd slowly dispersed, the light glinted off the star one last time. It shimmered in the warm afternoon sun, holding within it the echoes of a voice that had once lifted songs into the air with effortless grace. A voice that would continue to resonate long after the day's gathering faded into memory. And in that soft shimmer, one could almost hear it, the faint breath that had carried her story across time, still drifting gently, still unfinished, still alive. The soft shimmer of her star lingered in the afternoon light long after the crowd had thinned, catching on its surface as though holding one final breath of the ceremony. That shimmer, delicate and patient, followed those who walked away from the boulevard, settling into their thoughts with the quiet insistence of memory. It seemed to whisper that a story does not end with applause or mourning, or even with the carving of a name into stone. Instead, it continues in the spaces that follow, in the breath between one generation and the next, in the songs that drift across time, in the way a life is remembered, questioned, and rediscovered. It was from this lingering shimmer that Cass's legacy stepped forward, moving away from the tragedies that once overshadowed her and toward the tenderness that now shaped her place in history. In the years after her passing, as the cultural tides shifted and the world grew more reflective about the weight of expectation, people began to examine Cass Elliott's life with greater care. Scholars, musicians, and fans alike revisited her recordings, listening not for the mythologized figure they had once been fed, but for the woman within the music. They heard vulnerability woven into her phrasing, strength held beneath her softness, and a deep sincerity that rose through each performance. The clarity of her voice, warm, resonant, unmistakably hers, became a bridge between eras, reminding listeners of a time when harmonies shaped the soul of popular music. Yet beyond her artistry, a deeper recognition emerged. People began to understand the pressures Cass had endured, pressures that lingered largely unspoken during her lifetime. They saw a woman navigating the demands of an industry that celebrated authenticity while enforcing conformity. A woman whose body became the subject of scrutiny even as her voice lifted millions. They recognized the courage it took for her to walk onto stages that were not built for women like her, to insist on being heard when the world offered every reason to remain silent. In this recognition, Cass's story transformed. No longer a narrative of tragedy alone, but one of resilience and quiet defiance. As musicians in later decades explored the roots of harmony-driven folk rock, they returned repeatedly to the recordings of the Mamas and the Papas. They spoke of how Cass's voice anchored the group's sound, how her low register created a foundation upon which each song stood. Without her, the melodies lacked their depth. Without her, the harmonies lost their shape. Even those who had not lived through the era came to understand that Cass was not merely an accessory to the group. She was one of its defining pillars. Younger artists, discovering her music for the first time, often expressed a sense of awe that such a voice had once been overshadowed by concerns so superficial they seemed almost incomprehensible in hindsight. Through documentaries, interviews, and written histories, her story gained nuance. Writers approached her life with the care previously reserved for complex literary figures, examining her choices, her vulnerabilities, and the cultural environment that had shaped her trajectory. They explored the intersection of fame and identity, particularly for women in the mid-20th century, whose bodies became arenas for public judgment. Cass's struggles became a lens through which larger conversations emerged, about the demands placed on women in entertainment, about the quiet harm of persistent criticism, and about the ways talent is sometimes overshadowed by societal expectations. Owen, growing into adulthood, carried her mother's memory with a steady heart. She learned to navigate the public curiosity that occasionally resurfaced, answering questions with grace while keeping certain truths close. She spoke softly of her mother's laughter, of her generosity, of the warmth that seemed to fill every room she entered. And when asked about Cass's music, she often paused, listening in her mind to recordings she had grown up hearing. In those moments, she felt her mother's presence, not as a distant celebrity, but as a woman who had lived with courage and tenderness despite the storms that had surrounded her. In time, new listeners discovered Cass's recordings through films, television shows, and revived interest in 1960s American folk rock. Dream a Little Dream of Me found its way into countless soundtracks, drifting gently between generations. Each time the song resurfaced, people paused, drawn in by the softness of her tone, the sincerity of her delivery. Listeners unfamiliar with her story felt compelled to learn more, curious about the life behind the voice. And as they read, they found not only music, but a life filled with profound contrasts, success interwoven with heartbreak, public adoration shadowed by private struggle. Gradually, the myths surrounding her death, particularly the cruel and persistent rumor about the sandwich, began to fade. They were replaced by clearer truths, supported by medical records and first-hand accounts, restoring dignity to a moment long marred by speculation. Advocates, writers, and fans corrected misconceptions wherever they appeared, understanding that the way Cass's story was told mattered deeply. The world began to acknowledge the harm that careless narratives can inflict, especially when directed at someone who can no longer speak in her own defense. Her influence quietly extended beyond music. In conversations about body positivity, representation, and the pressures faced by women in the public eye, Cass's name surfaced as both caution and inspiration. Activists spoke of her experiences to illustrate how cultural attitudes could shape and sometimes distort a person's life. They pointed to her resilience as a reminder that brilliance often flourishes despite adversity, not because it is free of it. Through these discussions, Cass became part of a broader movement toward kindness, empathy, and understanding. Years slipped by, yet Cass remained a presence, alive in the notes of old recordings, in the stories her friends continued to tell, and in the lessons people drew from her journey. She existed in the warm timbre of a remembered harmony, in the soft laughter captured on studio tapes, in the quiet courage of those who face the world with gentleness despite its harshness. Her legacy was no longer confined to the arc of her career. It had become a landscape shaped by every life she touched. As time continued its steady march, the shimmer of her star still glowed on the Hollywood pavement, catching sunlight and lamplight alike. People paused there daily, some knowingly, others by chance, drawn to the name etched into stone. They took photographs, left flowers, or simply stood in silence for a moment. Still others walked past without recognizing the name, yet even they carried her influence unknowingly in the familiar chords of songs that had shaped their cultural memory. And so her story moved forward, not frozen in grief, but carried gently by those who understood that a legacy is not a conclusion. It is a continuation, a living echo. It was this echo, soft, steady, and resilient, that lingered into the final movement of Cass Elliott's story. For even as her life ended abruptly, her voice, her spirit, and the truths she embodied continue to rise, unmistakable and enduring, through every harmony that dares to dream a little dream once more